married around the Old Hall, and it was lovely to go round and enjoy the hall myself as well, so that was really good. So we're in for a very interesting talk tonight, which is Peacock Feathers and Paternosters, the post-mortem identity of Sir Thomas Burgh. So I hand over to Marianne. There will be a raffle, and there will be tea and biscuits at the end. Is that okay? Meanwhile, enjoy. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Paul. And good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see you all here in person this evening. Thank you very much to the friends of Gainsborough Old Hall for inviting me to speak and to share with you some of my research on wills in late medieval Lincolnshire. So tonight's talk is going to focus on Sir Thomas Burgh. And I noticed that Paul pronounces it Burgh, but I used to work at the National Archives, which is where this very beautiful volume of Sir Thomas Burgh's will comes from. And the pronunciation there was Burgh, so I'm going to go with that this evening. You'll have to forgive me if that goes against the local pronunciation.
Any Burgh then?
No, Thomas Burgh. So, Thomas Burgh, as I'm sure you all know, was the 15th century knight who built Gainsborough Old Hall. And the talk is going to examine evidence for Thomas Burgh's life and activities, and looking at how these are reflected in the post-mortem identity that he created through the choices that he made in his last will and testament. So Burgh's last will and testament is found in this volume that you see on the screen. His will stretches over 5 sides of parchment and extends to 226 lines of very detailed description about his preferences for the disposal of his body and soul and his goods after his death. But due to time constraints this evening, I could talk about Thomas Burgh's will in many different fashions, and you can ask me questions about it afterwards. I'm only going to focus on his pious and commemorative bequests. So the arrangements concerning his funeral monument, his chantry foundation, and his almshouse. Although it should be noted that he made other provision for his family members, servants, and other religious foundations and clergy. And although I might be preaching to the converted here, I'm going to begin by explaining why Sir Thomas Burgh is so worthy of note. So before we examine some of these bequests and requests made in Burgh's will in greater detail, it makes sense firstly to consider the evidence that we have for him during his life, the status and roles that he held, his political affiliations, and his role in local and national politics. The analysis of the commemorative provision of a late medieval knight, such as Thomas Burgh, makes a particularly interesting case study, as from the 1460s, Burgh had become King Edward IV's right-hand man in Lincolnshire, and was also one of the county's key participants in the activities of the Wars of the Roses. So Thomas Burgh's rise to prominence in royal service reveals that the peaks and the troughs of his career coincided with events in the Wars of the Roses and their repercussions. Born in 1430, Thomas Burgh was responsible for his family's growing influence in local and national affairs. His father, who was also called Thomas Burgh, had married Elizabeth Percy, who was one of the co-heiresses to a junior branch of the Earls of Northumberland. And Elizabeth had inherited from her father, Sir Thomas Percy of Harthill, among other things, the manor of Gainsborough, which she subsequently bequeathed to her son Thomas on her death in 1455. Burgh soon became embroiled in the events of the Wars of the Roses. This was a series of civil wars in England fought over the crown between 2 branches of the royal family, the houses of York and Lancaster, between between 1455 and 1487. And Burgh's early political affiliations during the initial phase of the Wars of the Roses were with the Lancastrian Earls of Stafford. So he was a member of the household of the Duke of Buckingham in 1457 and one of the Duke's feoffees by 1458. Lincolnshire was considered to have traditionally Lancastrian loyalties because the county of Lincolnshire contained many of the Duchy of Lancaster estates, most notably the Honour of Bolingbroke at the foot of the Wolds. But nonetheless, Thomas Burgh placed his loyalty to the Duke of Buckingham below his ambitions to raise his own status. So after the Duke's death in one of the major battles of the Wars of the Roses, the Battle of Northampton, on the 10th of July 1460, Thomas Burgh switched his affinity and committed himself to the victorious Yorkist faction, by whom he was made the Sheriff of Lincolnshire in autumn 1460. And this would have immediately boosted Thomas Burgh's standing within Lincolnshire, as the holding of this public office provided an obvious manifestation of his regional power and status, because the sheriff was considered to be the head of Lincolnshire in administrative terms. The sheriff was the king's agent in the county and retained prominence in local affairs through his position as head of the county courts, farmer of the shire, and recipient of executive orders. And it would also have allowed him to control and extend his own networks of patronage throughout the county and beyond to become a local, national, and regional figure of growing importance. And this was swiftly followed by Burgh's appointment as Esquire of the King's Body on the 2nd of April 1461. And this was merely 4 days after the Battle of Towton in Yorkshire, the Wars of the Roses' bloodiest war, and this confirmed Edward IV on the throne. As Esquire of the Body, Thomas Burgh would have waited personally on the king in his chamber, and as a trusted official, carried out duties which required reliability and discretion. Thomas Burgh had been knighted by February 1461, and he must have shown administrative competence and an interest in noble sports because he was appointed Master of the King's Horse by February 1464 and a Knight of the King's Body by 1466. And this was a really important honour. So after he was personally honoured by the king as a Knight of the Body, Burgh had a permanent and a lifelong membership to a privileged group which performed the central routine of court ceremonial. And Thomas Burgh's rise in the king's service was accompanied by generous patronage, including forfeited land from Lancastrian supporters in Lincolnshire and elsewhere. Thomas Burgh retained a significant position in the county administration, remaining a member of the Peace Commission for Lindsey for the remainder of Edward's reign. The patent rolls, a register of the letters patent which were issued by the king, recording grants of official positions, lands, commissions and privileges, revealed that throughout the 1460s and 70s, Thomas Burgh was the recipient of many advantageous gifts, positions and favours that exemplified his trusted position as part of King Edward IV's inner circle. His position of trust is further exemplified by the fact that before the end of his reign, Edward IV had named him as a councillor and also helped him into an advantageous marriage to Margaret, who was the Dowager Lady Botrow in 1464. So Margaret brought to the marriage the income from her estates in Wiltshire, Somerset and Devon, and also the prestige of marrying the daughter and widow of a peer of the realm. Thomas Burgh managed to successfully transfer to the new regime when Richard III acceded. He he maintained all of the local offices that he had held under Edward. Richard also elected Thomas Burgh as one of his Knights of the Order of the Garter, suggesting that he respected the loyalty that Thomas Burgh had shown to his brother Edward IV, and also wanted to be assured of this similar loyalty. But Thomas Burgh fared less well after the accession of Henry VII, as he lost most of his major offices within Lincolnshire to Henry's supporters, although he continued to be a royal councillor and served the king, taking part in all of these commissions, and his service was rewarded in 1487 with a summons to the House of Lords, although there is no evidence that he took up his seat as Lord Thomas Burgh. In his will, he described himself simply as Sir Thomas Burgh, Knight. And at the time of his death, Thomas Burgh was a man of considerable means, a knight who had served the country well and been handsomely rewarded. He even managed to survive several regime changes, retaining a good proportion of the lands and the titles that he had amassed throughout his career. So the evidence for Thomas Burgh's career suggests that he was a key military and political figure in Lincolnshire, as well as having influence at court throughout the later 15th century. But how would such a notable figurehead create a legacy for himself and for his family in advance of his death? Thomas Burgh's aspirations for styling himself as part of the Lincolnshire rural elite began with the construction of his majestic country house on the land bequeathed to him by his mother in Gainsborough. Gainsborough, as we all know because we're here this evening, is a small town situated in the northwest of Lincolnshire, about 18 miles from the county town of Lincoln. It sits on the River Trent and was for many years the furthest navigable point on that river for larger ships importing and exporting goods through the Humber estuary, so an important position within the country. Documentary evidence for the construction of Gainsborough Old Hall is not plentiful, and for many years it was believed that the manor house was mostly constructed post-1469. John Warkworth's chronicle refers to an attack on Burgh's manor house by a group of Lancastrian rebels in 1471, but it's not clear at this point how much of the structure had already been built and how much was demolished. Archaeological evidence, about which David Stocker has recently written, suggests that the hall was not built in a single phase, but instead was developed over a period of about 20 years. Gainsborough Old Hall was an impressive building with a large great hall, a west wing which contained 4 bays of lodgings, which I investigated thoroughly this afternoon, an east wing containing the state apartments, the northwest corner block, which contained a large kitchen, and in the northeast an imposing octagonal tower. A probate inventory for Thomas Burgh's household goods at Gainsborough Old Hall survives at the National Archives, although unfortunately it is damaged and incomplete, but it suggests that at least the Great Hall, the east wing, the tower and part of the east range were complete by the time of Thomas Burgh's death in 1496. Evidence from Richard III's itineraries indicate that he visited Gainsborough on the 10th of October 1483, and the assumption is that he stayed at Gainsborough Old Hall. This evidence has often been taken to imply that at that point much of the main building had been completed. The probate inventory also strongly suggests that the splendour of the house matched its size, as it lists the luxurious materials that appeared in many of the rooms, such as a pair of green curtains made of an expensive silk fabric called sarsenet, which were valued at 20 shillings, and those were in the inner parlour. And in the same room, it also lists 4 tapestries with imagery embroidered in gold thread, which which was valued at £6, 4 shillings and 6 pence. And in the medieval period, the annual wage of a chantry priest was about £5. So to have some tapestries worth £6 just suggests how much these valuable items would have cost and would have been worth. Many of the rooms were decorated with tapestries, and the bed in the tower chamber was covered with a canopy made of checkered velvet and cloth of gold. The house really would have been a magnificent statement of how Thomas Burgh wished other people to see him during his life, rich with the latest fashions in art and architecture, a model of opulence locally. So now that we've explored some of the surviving evidence for Thomas Burgh's life, we'll now return to consider his last will and testament, which he made on the 18th of February 1495, and which was proved before the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, which was the highest ecclesiastical court in England, and it was proved on the 19th of May 1496. So a last will and testament was a legal document usually made close to the death of the testator and declared the testator's wishes for the disposal of their cash, goods and property after their death. And there are many reasons why a testator who could afford to make a will would make one. And this included religious or spiritual concerns. Quite often, one of the first clauses in a medieval will commended one's soul to God, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and all saints. Concern for the fate of the soul reflected developments in late medieval religion. The notion of purgatory as a defined intermediary waiting room where one's soul endured cleansing torment before entering heaven was well established by the 15th century. Implicit in the Church's teaching was the possibility of shortening the duration of purgatorial suffering on a basis proportionate to merit accrued by works performed in life or by others on your behalf after your death. During the 12th and early 13th centuries, ideas had developed that particular liturgical acts, such as the Mass, had the capacity to extinguish the consequences of sin. This idea that sins had a particular value which needed the correct form of payment to be blotted from one's metaphorical copybook seems to be linked to these church teachings. And this idea would have been uppermost in the consciousness of people considering death and making wills. Historians have long debated how far the last will and testament can be used as accurate evidence of an individual's life, and particularly their religious interests. Clive Burgess, a very important Reformation and religious historian, has notably been critical of the will as a measure of lifetime piety. Whilst it is true that wills cannot provide a direct window into a person's character and lifetime piety, they can give us an idea of their personal circumstances, convictions, and their preferences. Other historians have noted that although wills do not always represent the extent and wealth of religious giving during an individual testator's lifetime sufficiently, they do not typically deviate widely from them. And there's a lot of evidence that's been found recently to support the idea of the will as a document where testators created and developed, rather than just reflected on, their own post-mortem identity. And much has been written about how religious material bequests of religious items that had either been commissioned by or had been owned and used by the testator would surely have reflected how they identified with their religion. The will, I believe, more than any other medieval document, provides a personal representation of both how a person viewed themselves and or how they wanted to be viewed by others and how they wanted to be commemorated and remembered. It was not unusual at this time for male members of the gentry class to expend time and money on their post-mortem provision. The wealthy man was considered to be merely a steward of his God-given wealth and was obliged to dispose of it in a pious and charitable manner or jeopardise the fate of his soul. At the time that he made his will, Thomas Burgh had recently provided the funds to build a chapel in his local parish church of All Saints in Gainsborough, which is situated adjacent to the manor house. Burgh's instructions for his tomb suggest that he was trying to carve out his own niche within this sacred space. He requested that his body, wheresoever it happened to decease, was to be buried in my new chapel. So these are the words from his actual will. And this is really interesting because considering Thomas Burgh's status within the county, and also the fact that he had developed relationships with members of Lincoln Cathedral, their dignitaries, it's likely that he could have requested burial within Lincoln Cathedral, which is what quite a lot of wealthy testators in Lincolnshire did in the 15th century. But instead, Thomas Burgh chose to focus commemoration of himself and his wife on his local church, situated just on the edge of the grounds of his manor house, a place where he'd likely worshipped frequently and which he'd interacted with on a regular basis throughout his life. Unfortunately, Thomas Burgh's chapel and monument have not survived, but you can see on the slide a similar tomb monument for a Knight of the Order of the Garter. So Thomas Burgh, in his will, requested that a large stone tomb should be constructed for himself and his wife at the north end of the altar in the chapel of All Saints, so the little chapel just on the right-hand side of the altar. Margaret had died already in 1488, and Burgh wanted burying beside her in his new chapel, but he gave very specific details about how he wished for himself and his wife to be represented on his tomb. So he wanted an effigy of himself, so a representation of his body, wearing his mantle of the garter, with a garter around his leg, bearing arms, so with a sword, and of his wife, with remembrance of their personal heraldry and the day of their commemorative services. So Thomas Burgh's choice to be portrayed carrying a weapon and wearing the insignia of the most noble order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry, indicates his wish to convey the importance of his status on the national and international stage, alongside perhaps a desire to evoke associations with the ideal of the traditional chivalric gentleman. It demonstrates his pride in his military achievements in the Wars of the Roses and the royal family's recognition of his family's loyalty with his representation of the Order of the Garter. And this idea is reinforced by Thomas Burgh's request to include armorial shields on his monument to demonstrate his lineage and connections. Heraldry was the language of the gentry and the nobility, who used it to set themselves apart from the lower orders and to differentiate themselves from each other according to their ranks of degree. But funeral monuments that advertise the individual's temporal glories and mortal decay ensured that the imagery of their death was accompanied by the appropriate emblems identifying their position in life. And it was also a representation of Thomas Burgh's social success, and his use of both heraldry and the style of his monument suggests that this was the identity that he wished to project to to others. A major concern for Thomas Burgh was to speed his soul through purgatory by ensuring the arrangement of as many soul-saving masses as possible, and he left complicated instructions to ensure that this aspect of his post-mortem commemoration was well provided for. Most pressing, however, was Thomas Burgh's desire to make provision for his perpetual chantry. So, a chantry referred to an arrangement whereby a person would make an endowment, usually of land, property or money, to a church or a monastery to employ one or more priests to say a daily mass for their soul and to pray for them. So Thomas Burgh was very concerned to set up a chantry to make sure that his soul and the soul of his wife was well provided for. And a historian called Colin Richmond has described Thomas Burgh's will as being as pedantic as that of any lawyer in its directions for the establishment of his chantry. Most gentry wills that indicate a wish to establish a chantry often lack detailed information about the type of foundation that they intend to set up. So some historians have suggested that this could indicate that many founders viewed the ordination of a chantry as more provision of a parish amenity to provide a priest to say masses for the community, rather than it being specifically for their own soul. But if this were the case, then Thomas Burgh's attempted testamentary micromanagement of his chantry might suggest that he viewed it more as being his own personal form of commemoration, less for the parish and more for the benefit of his family and his heirs. The endowment for Thomas Burgh's perpetual chantry at the altar of St Mary the Virgin in his new chapel at All Saints Church was finalised after his executors applied to the Crown for a licence in January 1499. So, in his will, Thomas Burgh assigned a particularly generous annual stipend of £10 for the chaplain of his chantry. So I think you might remember I said before, the average annual wage for a chaplain was £5. Thomas Burgh was giving his chaplain £10. But the chaplain of Thomas Burgh's chantry would have had to work very hard for this generous payment in order to follow Thomas Burgh's very rigid guidelines governing the maintenance of this chantry, and also guidelines governing their own personal life and activities. There are 16 lines in Thomas Burgh's will dedicated to outlining the very specific circumstances concerning how, by whom, and in default of whom, and in what eventuality the chantry chaplain should be appointed, the length of time and the periods of the year that the chaplain might be permitted to be away from the chantry, and the arrangements that he should make during this time for a deputy to continue saying the masses, the arrangements that should be made if the chaplain were to fall ill, as well as his very carefully prescribed living arrangements. Thomas Burgh also made very generous material provision for his chantry, as he wanted to make every effort to ensure that it will be able to operate as quickly as possible after his death, and also that Mass could be appropriately celebrated. Among other things, Thomas Burgh bequeathed a Mass book, a chalice, his best braille, an antiphonal with a processional, so 2 liturgical Mass books, a silver candlestick, some silver dishes, and a silver pack spread, only for the use of his chantry. You can see on the slide some items that were likely similar to those bequeathed by Burgh. We don't have any records for the exact ones, but these are likely to be similar. And these items would have had very functional uses, so they were necessary items for the provision and maintenance of these religious services. But Thomas Burgh's bequest of vestment for his chantry priest made an important statement. So I'm going to quote directly from the will here. I bequeath to my said chantry my white suite of vestments, a cope and 2 tappets of the same, with 2 curtains of white sarcenet for my altar there, and also my suite of peacock feathers for my obbit keeping there, and a cope to be made for the same for my said chantry. So this suite made of peacock feathers most likely refers to a set or suite of vestments intended to be worn together with images of peacock feathers embroidered onto them, and the cope referred to was probably intended to be made to match the other vestments. But this would have been a very unique commission, as standard vestment decoration in the later medieval period was usually restricted to more generic motifs such as seraphim, bells, lilies, or double-headed eagles. Peacocks were cultural symbols of prestige, and this bird might have been particularly favoured by Thomas Burgh, bearing in mind his penchant for ostentation and grandiloquent display. If Thomas Burgh shared an affinity with the peacock, a bird which has been associated with symbolising vainglory, we should not perhaps be too much surprised. But peacocks had a wide range of symbolism in the medieval period. Images such as these in illustrated bestiaries across Europe demonstrated how the peacock shed its feathers every year and then grew new ones. So because of this, a belief developed that the peacock's flesh did not decay after death, and therefore the peacock also became a symbol of the immortal Christ. And we can see the results of this belief in the peacock as being a symbol of Christ in mid-15th century paintings, such as the Adoration of the Magi by Fra Angelico and Filippo Lippi, where the peacock perched above the stable has been considered to represent the resurrection of Jesus. In addition to this, the pattern on peacock feathers, which resemble an eye, has been associated with the all-seeing eye of God and being a symbol of foresight. So a vestment which was embroidered with peacock feathers would have been an expensive donation, but would have also made an important statement about Thomas Burgh's wealth and his status. And in addition to this, the representation of peacock feathers on a vestment that would have been worn for the celebration of Mass might tie in with this belief that Christ sees all things, and that whilst no one could escape death, prayers and masses were considered to be the way to achieve true salvation. But on the whole, the set of bequests for Thomas Burgh's chantry are quite lavish, including numerous valuable silver items, and this appears to stem from his profound concern for the maintenance of his chantry. And this idea is further reinforced by the fact that the first 2 folios of Thomas Burgh's will are dedicated to the provision of complex rules and regulations attempting to control every aspect of his chantry devotions. So Thomas Burgh made a prescriptive weekly timetable outlining the specific masses and prayers that he wanted to form part of his chantry mass devotions. So on each day, his chantry chaplain would be expected to say a mass devoted to a different liturgical feast. So he requested that his chantry chaplain should sing Mass of the Holy Trinity on Sundays, Mass of the Holy Spirit on Mass of the Holy Trinity on Sundays, Mass of the Holy Spirit on Mondays, Mass of Mary Magdalene on Tuesdays, Mass of Requiem on Wednesdays, Mass of All Saints on Thursdays, Mass of Jesus Christ on Fridays, and Mass of St. Mary on Saturdays. After the offertory at each Mass, the chantry chaplain was instructed to recite the Psalm De Profundis with the collect Festina Fidelius for the souls of Thomas Burgh and his wife, rehearsing their names and also rehearsing the names of his parents, ancestors, and also praying for future generations of Thomas Burgh's family. So Thomas Burgh's Chantry Mass timetable was an unusual request for a night. Not all gentry men were so prescriptive with their devotional requests. They were actually usually prepared to leave the celebration of their Chantry Mass to the discretion of the celebrant and the liturgical calendar. But here, Thomas Burgh is indicating a particular devotion to the Holy Trinity, the Blessed Virgin Mary, all saints, and also interestingly Mary Magdalene. He was clearly concerned that his perpetual chantry should reflect his personal liturgical tastes and encompass a wide range of personal devotions. And it was not just the content of the masses that Thomas Burgh was keen to specify, it was also the timings. He specifically requested that all of his masses should take place at 9 a.m. and that they should take place before the parish mass. And the chantry priest was instructed to knell or arrange for someone else to knell the church bells for an hour before his chantry mass, so that people realised that his mass was going on and had time to get from the manor house to the church to attend his mass. So these masses were clearly designed to benefit future generations of Thomas Burgh's household, and the timing of these masses were carefully considered to encourage attendance and therefore prayers at Thomas Burgh's daily masses of remembrance. And the other foundation that Thomas Burgh established in Gainsborough was a series of almshouses. These no longer exist, but you can see on the slide a similar set of almshouses that were established in Burford in Oxfordshire. So Thomas Burgh requested that his executors should establish dwellings for 5 poor beadsmen in the parish of All Saints, who were to be paid 1 pence a day, not very much, to attend Thomas Burgh's chantry masses and pray for his soul. So a beadman was a poor person from within the parish who would be paid specifically to pray for their benefactor, so the person who was paying them. The poor men were to be chosen from people who had given service to Thomas Burgh or to his heirs, and they might have been kind of poor people who had been his servants, but had maybe encountered disabilities, which meant they were no longer able to serve him, and maybe they'd fallen into poverty. So this was a way to ensure, in a time when there was no poor relief, that poor people were provided for within the parishes. So Thomas Burgh, his will stated that each beadman was to receive a new gown every other year, price of 3 shillings and 4 pence. But similarly to Burgh's chantry chaplain, his beadsmen would certainly have had to earn their place in the almshouse, because Thomas Burgh, once again, was incredibly specific about the day-to-day activities of these beadsmen. So Thomas Burgh directed that in addition to attending his chantry masses, if the beadsmen were literate, then he wanted them to recite daily matins, prime, and the hours and even song of Our Lady. Also, once a day, they were to recite the Psalter of the Virgin Mary on their knees in Thomas Burgh's chapel in the parish church, and also to accompany the priest by saying the words of the prayer De Profundis with him during the Mass. So if they were literate, these beadsmen would have had quite a lot of praying to do to earn their 1 pence a day. If the beadsmen were illiterate, it's fine, because Thomas Burgh has given some additional instructions for them. If they were illiterate, then they were required to know by heart the Pater Noster, or the Our Father, and the Ave Maria, or the Hail Mary prayers, and the Creed. And if not, they were not permitted to be beadsmen. So they had to know these prayers, they had to be able to say these prayers for Thomas Burgh's soul. This was obviously very important to him. Thomas Burgh's illiterate bedesmen also had to know the Psalter of the Virgin Mary off by heart because they had to recite it twice daily on their knees within the chapel. And at all times, the bedesmen were told that they had to be engaged with remembering, that's what it says in the will, remembering the souls of Thomas and all the other Burghs. And this suggests that Thomas Burgh's concept of charity and concern for the poor was specifically limited locally to the poor, immediately connected with his own family and with the parish of Gainsborough. Again, ensuring that his family's name was remembered specifically through these prayers of the poor bedesmen. So, at the point of Thomas Burgh's death, he had successfully improved the local and national standing of his family through his rewarding career in royal service, which had allowed him to develop his power and his influence locally. And this meant that Thomas Burgh was very well placed to extend his influence beyond his death and into the commemorative sphere of his social environment. Regardless of whether or not self-interest was Thomas Burgh's main motivation for funding different types of commemorative provision in his parish of All Saints, by concentrating most of his provision locally, the wider community of the parish still benefited. Thomas Burgh's role as Lord of the Manor of Gainsborough was clearly an important part of his identity, and therefore his local parish church became the focus of the post-mortem provision in his will. Thomas Burgh's will has revealed an interesting series of meticulous instructions for material bequests and requests, which would have been carefully crafted in order to create a particular post-mortem identity and a legacy for himself and for his family. But obviously the full picture is clearly more complicated. When we try to explain the significance of these different bequests, and we think of them as being part of a complex chain of interactions and expectations and ways of bonding and social control, the meaning of some of these bequests that were made in his will can prove a little bit difficult to untangle. Identity is often as elusive as it is central to individual lives and collective experiences. Thomas Burgh's anxiety for his post-mortem insurance might appear obsessive, but there are other examples of 15th century laymen of gentry status whose fear of death and worse, damnation and anonymity pushed them to do everything in their power to mitigate the suffering of their soul and to bring them closer to salvation and remembrance, although few bear such extraordinary attention to detail as Thomas Burgh. The elaborate provision that he made, bequeathing luxury fabrics for vestments, as well as producing this complex timetable of masses for his chantry, indicative of his own personal devotions, served to underline his own personal piety, whilst also creating an impression of his vast wealth and therefore his powerful position in society. The monument that he commissioned for himself and his wife reinforces this idea, so he requested to be depicted bearing arms and with his family shields, proclaiming his lineage and connections and thus presenting an image of a person who was worthy of commemoration by other people and future generations. The success of a layman in life was, in this way, equated with the worthiness of commemoration in death. Thomas Burgh appears to have had an understanding that, whilst it was desirable to highlight his worldly social status and wealth through his post-mortem provision, it was also essential to emphasise his earthly piety in preparation for heaven. So thank you very much. That's the end of my lecture. And I'll be very happy to take any questions.
How long after his death or do we know how long this chantry kept going? I mean, would it be during the lifetime of the man appointed, or would it be somebody else? I mean, how long would it go on for?
Well,
Years, months?
Well, in the medieval period, when people were establishing chantries, they didn't realise that the Reformation was coming in the 16th century. So the chantries were dissolved in the mid-1530s.
Right.
So Burgh's chantry would only have had quite a short lifetime, but he wouldn't have known that, you see. And he left quite a significant endowment so that he could have a perpetual chantry. So often, if people wanted to have a perpetual chantry, they would bequeath land or property that they could rent out so that there would be continually an income
So
to provide.
So there would be a successor to the original appointee?
Yeah, exactly.
Ad infinitum?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
some of the chantries in Lincoln Cathedral, for example, were established in the 13th century and lasted 300 years, for example. Yes, sometimes they had to amalgamate with other chantries because they ran out of money, but if you could afford to endow a perpetual chantry, that was desirable. Some people, if they couldn't afford it, they would just leave a smaller amount of money and they'd have one for, say, 5 years, for example. And sometimes people, they wanted to make sure that their chantry was of good quality because at this point, some of the chantry priests were a little bit lax in their moral behaviour. So sometimes people would put stipulations within their will to make sure that they wanted good and honest priests. They wanted priests who were going to be devoted to performing the chantry masses. And again, going back to Lincoln Cathedral, some of the priests who attended the chantries there were fined by the Dean and Chapter for playing dice, drinking. I think they were consorting with suspect women, things like this. So people were very aware that they wanted their chantry to be a reflection of them almost, a reflection of their own personality and what they wanted for themselves. So I can understand in a way why Thomas Burgh was so very prescriptive about his chantry.
But you're right, it does seem enormously self-obsessive, doesn't it? You're so obsessed with your own, you know, that you don't think about all the people who are too poor to afford it. You just, as long as you're saying you've done all that, it seems, was it a common thought in those days that only the rich were deserving of this sort of thing?
Well, there were different ways.
Or was it because of they'd been so indoctrinated by the church? And, yeah.
So the church made it very clear that if you were rich, it was your responsibility to use your wealth in a way to fund different outlets, to pray for yourself and your family. Quite often people would include, and for all Christian souls, along with prayers for themselves and their family, but as you say, that might have been a token gesture to include them. If you were a poorer person and you wanted to be prayed for, you could join a guild. So a guild was a voluntary association with brothers and sisters from within the parish who joined together and they paid a subscription, and it was sort of a bit like a mutual insurance. So members of the guild would pray for each other. They would make sure that all members of the guild had a good funeral, and they would make sure that if any members of the guild fell into poverty, then there would be a pot for them to kind of take out of. So if you were poor, there were still ways that you could have prayers, but they wouldn't be as specific as the ones that, like Thomas Burgh requested. And it was also believed at the time that praying for someone and saying their name was more efficacious than just praying for people generally. So if you prayed for Thomas Burgh specifically, it was very much preferable to sort of praying for all Christian souls, for example, because I don't know whether they thought, you know, God wasn't going to know who was being prayed for, something like that. But it's certainly a very interesting, very interesting point. I work on wills from medieval Lincolnshire more generally. I've done a lot of work on wills within Lincoln, and how I came across Sir Thomas Burgh was because Thomas Burgh actually lived in Lincoln Cathedral Close in the 1460s. He rented one of the houses on Pottergate while Gainsborough Old Hall was being built. Often members of the gentry would have a town house, a town residence. So he had a residence there, and he connected he developed quite close connections with the chapter of Lincoln Cathedral, which was why he might have been able to be buried there, because in his will, two of his executors were William Skelton, who was the treasurer of Lincoln Cathedral, and Geoffrey Simeon, who was the chancellor. So he had friends in high places, and that was how I became interested in him, because I looked at his will and I thought, this is incredible to have a will of a lay person, because quite often members of the higher clergy have wills that go on for pages and pages. You know, if you were the Archdeacon of Bedford or something, you might have a will that went on for about 5 pages, giving money to different places. But wills of knights, having these kind of very complicated post-mortem provision, are quite rare, and I think it does say something about Thomas Burgh and his connections with Gainsborough as well. The fact that he, you know, concentrated his provision so locally, because quite often people would, I suppose, they want to be remembered in the place that was the most significant, where it would be most likely for them to reach greater numbers of people. So Lincoln Cathedral would have been a good choice for him, but the fact that he chose to be commemorated locally says a lot about how he felt about his parish and his community. So I just thought that was really, really interesting.
Would you agree, Marianne, that he was sort of establishing a dynasty of his family?
Yes, yes. And I mean, I haven't talked about I could do another paper on the request that he made to his family, because he had 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, and the bequests that he made to them are very interesting as well. Personal bequests of jewellery, and also bequests of valuable items such as church bells, because bells were very heavy and made of metal, could be melted down and sold. It was really interesting that he made these particular bequests, and also his bequests to his servants are very interesting. He treated his servants incredibly well, and he obviously viewed them as friends as well as being servants. So I think in what he was doing in establishing his family and making provision for future generations, he was also trying to ensure that the success of the future kind of dynasty, as he said.
Do we know what happened to the things that were requested? For example, jewellery. Imagine they're passed down by the family and being lost through the ages. Or are they in museums? Or?
No, unfortunately not. So sadly, how it happens quite often with these things is we have lovely descriptions of them in these documents, and then they're either passed on and lost in the sands of time, or sold and passed on to kind of different families. So we don't actually know where any of this kind of stuff has ended up. And Thomas Burgh actually bequeathed some lovely things. So to his son, he bequeathed a silver cup full of jewels, which had been given to him by the Archbishop of York. You know, some really lovely things. And I'd love to know what happened to all of these wonderful items, but sadly we can't. But what is so interesting about these wills is that they give us an idea of the material culture of the time, so what things people had, and also looking at what was bequeathed to whom, what the strength of that relationship was with a person. So if you're bequeathing your jewels and your silver cups to somebody, that's obviously quite a strong relationship. If you're bequeathing, I don't know, 1 pence to somebody, it's indicating a kind of less strong connection. So it's really interesting.
So is Sir Thomas buried at Lincoln, and is there a tomb or a plaque?
No, so he was buried in the chapel in All Saints, but
Oh, right.
but when the church was refurbished, all the bones were taken out and put into the crypt. So the monuments of Thomas Burgh and his wife that would have been there were destroyed, unfortunately, because I think they would have been quite spectacular. No, it's a real shame. I went and had a look today, and it's a storage area.
So there are no bones left in the crypt.
I imagine they will be there. No, they'll have the bones there, but the tomb monuments and the effigies will be gone, which is a shame. It's a real shame, actually, because the way that Burgh's tomb was described, it would have been really interesting to see exactly how he and his wife, he wanted them to be positioned. And we have these very detailed descriptions in the will, but it would have been nice to see. We don't know if the tomb was created the way that Burgh wanted it. So if you see what I mean, in a will, you can only specify your wishes, but we don't know how far they were carried out. So although Burgh specified this was how he wanted his tomb, we now have no way of knowing whether that monument was created in the way that he requested it. So it's a real shame. It's really sad.
Have you investigated any separate chantry buildings at all? They weren't always
No.
contained in churches and cathedrals, were they?
Do you mean sort of separate chapels?
Yes, separate chantry buildings. Yeah.
Yeah, so sometimes, St Mary Magdalene Church in Newark, for example, one of the key funders of the parish there, they built their own chantry chapel within the church, and it's really interesting actually. You can still see it today, just a little one, but quite often, because you can imagine that people would have wanted. A lot of people within particular parishes would have wanted a chantry. There would have been altars all around the church. So St Mary Magdalene in Newark, for example, had about 20 altars, all at different points. So there would have been the high altar, and then there would have been these separate little chantry altars. And it's difficult to sort of see how they would have arranged that space. But there would have been these separate little altars all around at different points, which different founders had paid for, and to have their separate priests. And sometimes people even paid for lodging for their priests, so they might have more than one priest serving their chantry. So in Lincoln Cathedral, Bartholomew Burgh's chantry had 6 priests serving his chantry, and he also paid for them to have a house in the cathedral close where they all lived together communally. So you can, it was very interesting the way that people created these little kind of chantry legacies for themselves, and whether or not they had a separate chapel or it was just an altar, it was a way for them to kind of carve out a space for themselves in their parish church.
Do we know where the almshouses were situated in Gainsborough?
No, I'm afraid not. I don't know if anybody else does.
I think I
You know, Paul?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And we do have a picture, a photograph in the 19th century
Okay.
of what they looked like. They were on what we call Church Street.
Okay.
It
That
looked
makes sense.
onto Acton Street in the town.
But aren't those almshouses by the
Also
side of the church?
Yes.
Yes, I know they're more modern, but
Those of
they're
you know the town, I think the Salvation Army
on.
had their citadel or whatever, more or less on the site of it. Can I thank you? I mean, we've got this legacy of this lovely building that we've enjoyed this afternoon. But what an insight documents can give us. And somehow or other, Sir Thomas Burgh has come alive for us in many ways. He sounds quite an
He
interesting...
would have been a character. He would certainly have been a character.
Absolutely, and I do thank you for your work.
No,
and
thank you
research.
for
It's
having
been
me.
lovely. I'm just sorry that very few of